Hello. Good morning. I hope you had a refreshing tea break. We will continue our session with our next plenary talk, which will be by Professor B.C. Chowdhury, who will talk about post-independence wildlife conservation models in India, a review of lessons learned for refinement of pathways. Professor B.C. Chowdhury is a pioneering Indian wildlife biologist, herpetologist, and wetland expert, recognized as one of the country's first-generation wildlife scientists. He served nearly 30 years in the Wildlife Institute of India, retiring as a senior professor and scientist G in 2012. Professor Chowdhury has coordinated over 50 national and international conservation projects and has authored over 100 publications, as well as trained several generations of wildlife professionals. Over to you, Professor Chowdhury.
ये है ना मेरी टॉप इसको ऑन करो नीचे वाला Good morning. This has been a wonderful time for all of you, but particularly for me, it is almost like homecoming, being with the Institute for almost 30 odd years and being invited to talk to you people. And also, it's a pleasure because the kind of generations what we see in this audience. And what I'm going to talk about is a generational shift in the conservation ethos of this country. And probably, as we said, we have inherited this from our next generation, not from our forefathers. And therefore, I think what I'm going to talk here is largely trying to prepare a roadmap what would be the responsibility of the generation which are taking over from us. But having said that, I wonder when exactly India's conservation program started. We inherited in 1947 from the Britishers a mixed bag because 100 odd princely states had their own programs of wildlife conservation, and the Britishers, who actually took up the forest as their exploitation forest, have their own mechanism of wildlife, I wouldn't say conservation, wildlife exploitation. So when 1947, when we became an independent country, from 1947 to 1952, there probably was very little on what exactly needs to be done for wildlife conservation. Okay. And largely because many of the princely states who were using wildlife resources as a means of protection, ultimately for hunting purposes, but they were also the ones who were trying to say, let's protect these areas so that the possibility of hunting actually enhances. Many of you who may have gone to Keoladeo Ghana National Park would have seen the history of how many birds were shot in a day using how many guns. Okay. But it's a reminder of what we inherited. And on that note, I start my presentation. And when we say pre-independence wildlife conservation models, largely princely states, hunting reserves, largely for big game hunting, and but interestingly, many of them had seasonal restrictions. And but there were a few areas which have been taken as conservation focus. 1905, Kaziranga Reserve Forest established to safeguard the one-horned rhino. So probably for a large mega herbivore, the first program in India was in the 1905. And today, one of the most funded program in the wildlife conservation is the Asiatic lion. The Honorable Prime Minister has declared almost 2,900 crores for the Gir lion. But 1911, the Gir sanctuary was declared by the Nawab of Junagadh. And if he had not started it in 1911, probably there wouldn't have been Asiatic lion and there wouldn't have been an allocation of 2,900 crores. Okay. 1936, what we know today as Corbett, the Haley National Park was established, and today Corbett, which also happened to be the first area where the Project Tiger was launched, was known as the Haley National Park. 1936, the district collector of the then Madras Presidency declared Vedantangal as the bird sanctuary, not by the forest, but it is the district collector who declared the Vedantangal bird sanctuary, and today Vedantangal is Ramsar site. 1940, Mudumalai Wildlife Sanctuary under the Madras Presidency. But what is interesting here to note, it was the individual opinion leaders and influencers for wildlife conservation and what needs to be done. And many of them were expats, Britishers, EPG, Anglo-Indian, P.D. Strachey, Jim Corbett, but they shifted the baton to people like Dr. Salim Ali, J.C. Daniel, M. Krishnan, M. Seshadri, and so on. So I think, there was a shift of baton from Britishers to Indians, and they were the influencers. So if you are talking about the early part of 1950s, it was a few Indian individuals who influenced. And interestingly, the post-independence wildlife conservation effort began only in 1952. So 1947 to 1952 was kind of a no man's land, no man era. There really was nothing called wildlife conservation happening in this country, and there was nothing called a policy. And in 1952, the Indian Board for Wildlife was existing in a different name. It was called the Central Board for Wildlife, and only in the first meeting, the name was changed to Indian Board for Wildlife. And interestingly, then the IBWL was not being chaired by a minister, not even by the Prime Minister. The first Indian Board for Wildlife was chaired by the Wadiyar Maharaja of Mysore. So I think it's interesting to know, at that point of time, it was those former princely states who were actually telling, we were hunters, but we want to shift into conservationists. And that's how the change came. And in the first meeting of the Indian Board for Wildlife, the decline of wildlife in India due to lack of protection and complementary regulation was officially recognized. It was said there is no legislation and there is no monitoring of what exactly is the status of our wildlife. And that was first recorded in 1952, first Indian Board for Wildlife. This initiated the setting up of the few wildlife sanctuaries across India. It's very interesting. The first sanctuary which was declared after the 1952 Board of Wildlife meeting was actually a small little sanctuary presently in Telangana called Pakhal Wildlife Sanctuary. It's a small lake, and that was the first sanctuary which was declared. And then, of course, a few larger number of sanctuaries which were established. Someone sitting here, slightly older than me, Dr. Bharucha, in his wonderful book, The History of 3 volumes, one has to actually eat about 3 or 4 lunch to take his book, and it's about 25 kg, 3 volumes. But he has recorded all these things in his book. Between 2003 and 2025, interestingly, the Indian Board for Wildlife's name was changed to National Board for Wildlife, but National Board for Wildlife recently held its 7th meeting. So from 2003 to 25, it's a long period, 22 years, but only 7 meetings of the National Board for Wildlife took place. So what I mean to say is, even after post-independence, even after trying to chart a path for wildlife conservation, our National Board for Wildlife do not meet regularly. So I think that's something which I wanted to say. The need for the apex body to meet more regularly to review and realign wildlife conservation efforts in India. It's our wish list, but whether it is going to happen or not, that's only time can tell. But it's probably the pressure groups, the opinion leaders are no longer there at this point of time. It is only organizations, institutions, and forums like this who will take across the idea that we must make sure the National Board for Wildlife at least meets regularly. Okay. The pre-independence forest policy, because forest and wildlife cannot be separated, 1864-65, the Imperial Forest Service was established, and most of the forests in India were taken over by the Britishers, largely for exploitation purpose. The Indian Railways was growing, and they needed sleepers, so the salt trees were required, and there was a big focus on coal mining, and salt trees were required as pillars to be used in the coal sector. I think those of you who have read the book by Ramchandra Guha, The Unquiet Woods, will probably know how India's railway growth is one of the reasons for decline of our forest cover largely. Okay, exploitation forestry. 1894, the first forest policy was drafted by the Britishers, and the focus was again timber harvesting to meet the need of railways and the coal mines. The other agenda was elimination of big carnivores because they were a hindrance to forestry operations. In fact, many of my forest officer colleagues who are sitting here, they would have probably heard from their seniors how if you want a promotion in your cadre, the first thing they were asked was, have you hunted a tiger? Okay. That was at some point of time, this is what my first boss in the forest department was actually someone who worked with the Nizam's forest in Hyderabad. And he said he was awarded 6 anna, that time it was anna, 6 anna for hunting a tiger. So that was the focus. Timber operations will have to hamper if you do not take out the carnivores. So that was the pre-independence focus on the conservation. The post-independence forest policy, 1952, the national forest policy emphasized conservation to a larger extent, but that was what also said 1/3 of the geographic area must be under forest cover. And thankfully, to this day, I think, still India is wanting 1/3 area under the forest cover, but it also has interesting connotations. Some of the states say, but we have 70% forest cover. So allow us to exploit rest of the forest, we will bring it to 33. Even the other kind of dialogue also keeps going on. It's not important to say those states which have 7% forest, they don't want to go to 33, but it's only 72 forest cover, they want to come back to 33. So I think it's something worrying which needs to be looked at. It also emphasized the ecological goods and services provider role of the forest. I remember to have read a paper in 1971 written by two eminent forest officers. Some of the names you may have heard, Saroj Raj Chaudhary from Orissa, and then one more forest officer for Andhra Pradesh. They have written a book. They have written a paper in New Scientist. They said there is nothing called minor forest produce. Probably they were the first one to say, take the word minor forest produce. Every single forest produce is important, and probably that is what today has brought the non-timber forest produce timber terminology. The importance of wildlife conservation in forested landscape was also recognized in the 1952 National Forest Policy, but it also took a long time for the next forest policy to come. 1988 Forest Policy shifted the focus from exploitation forestry and revenue generation to conservation and sustainable use of forest and forest resources. So to some extent, 1988 can be taken after 1952, the amalgamation of forest with wildlife conservation. But what we need, the review, a quicker review of the National Forest Policy and evolving a more holistic and integrated ecological approach that considers both forest and wildlife. So what is happening? We do not have a national wildlife policy. We have a forest policy, but if we have a forest policy and if we have a national wildlife policy, they will probably work in silos, and that is something which is not wanted. What we want is an integrated approach of forest and wildlife policy together. And hopefully, in future, that's something which might come. The Indian Wildlife Protection Act, 1972, to be precise, it took almost 20 years, 1952 to 1972. But in between 1952 and 1972, something very interesting happened. 1969, New Delhi hosted the IUCN Conservation Congress, and that was probably one of the biggest watershed, I should say, because 1969 World Conservation Congress of IUCN brought into focus for the first time the plight of the tigers. It was a questionnaire survey conducted by the Bombay Naturalistic Society, who presented that what is being talked about turn of the century 40,000 tigers in 1969, it probably requires a real conservation effort, otherwise the tiger is going to go extinct. So that is 1969 BNHS presentation in the IUCN Congress, not only tigers, but it also talked about many other species which requires conservation effort, and that is what also brought in 1952, the legislation requirement was focused, but it took 20 years for the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act to be formed and to be enacted. And what was the focus on the 1972 Protection Act? Setting up a protected area, national park and sanctuaries, just two categories, providing legal protection to Indian wildlife through placement into Schedule 1 to Schedule 6. But what was interesting at that point of time, the schedules were not based on population status or the threat perception. It was mostly threat, how many species are in the conjunctive use sector. And that's how the Schedule 1 to Schedule 6 were brought into in the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act. The present situation is somewhat different. Multiple amendments of the Act, the most major one being 2013, and the 2022, the most recent one, 23, it was formally adopted. And what is interesting, now we have only Schedule 1 and 2, and 22 amendment links schedules to the CITES appendices. But it would be interesting for us to realize keeping the species into the schedules is not just a one-way traffic. keeping a species in Schedule 1 must require an action plan how to take conservation efforts so that you can take them from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 and so on. So I think it's important for us. What is need is a 72 Protection Act amended multiple times, but what we need is at least a decadal review, and based on the review, an action taken during the previous decade, what has been done, and what needs to be done to shift this species from one schedule to other category. And also it is important to align them into the IUCN categories, the red list and the green list and so on. We need to be doing actions based on the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act schedules, what action need to be taken so that we can shift the species from one schedule to another schedule. The beginning of the species-centric wildlife conservation effort, 1969, the Asiatic lion sanctuary upgradation. Not many people probably talk about that. At that point of time, Gujarat was under the president's rule, and one of the advisors, T.K. Sattarwala, was the person who actually made the rubble wall, which actually fences the core area of the Gir sanctuary. So that was probably the first action done, and that core area which was created was made devoid of the Maldharis. So the real conservation action for Asiatic lion began in 1969, and then of course a lot of things has happened. 1969, I talked about the IUCN Conservation Congress. 1973, the launch of the Project Tiger, but between 69 and 73, it was the WWF International, WWF Global, which pledged $1 million, and Mrs. Gandhi said, we will pledge much more than that, and that is how the 9 tiger reserves in the country was initiated. And today, after 50 years, we probably have 53 tiger reserves. It's a different question. A large number of habitats have come under Project Tiger, but hoping that they will at least some point of time support tigers. And currently, at least 40% of the tiger reserves are without tigers. And it's another thing, rewilding tigers will go to the tiger reserve. That's completely another matter, which probably we will see. 1975 also saw the launch of the Crocodile Conservation Project. Just last week, Odisha, the state where it was initiated, celebrated 50 years of the crocodile conservation. And interestingly, the Prime Minister in the 7th meeting of the National Board for Wildlife declared a new Gharial project. The Gharial is still in the critical endangered category. So the idea is to shift the Gharial from the critical endangered category into a better category. 1976, the Sea Turtle Project launched in Odisha. 1992, the Project Elephant. Today we have 33 elephant reserves. 2009, Project Snow Leopard. 2023, all of you know, the Project Cheetah. And 2025, the Project Asiatic Lion, 2,900 crores, which is probably the largest ever fund ever given to a species. There are also national species recovery programs that currently includes 22 species, 16 terrestrial and 6 aquatic, prioritized for focused conservation. Key species are Great Indian Bustard. This institute is involved with the Great Indian Bustard, dugong, sangai, dolphin, Bengal florican, and so on. So I think, many of the youngsters sitting here must be wondering, do we have an opportunity to work with a critically endangered species or rare species? So I think, it's not just 16 terrestrial and 6 aquatic. I think the total number of species identified are actually a little more than 44. So I think you have an opportunity to work with critically endangered species within your time frame. But there is a need to review and launch programs for several other endemic and lesser known species. We have been far too much tiger-centric, far too much elephant-centric, far too much rhino-centric. We probably move away from these enigmatic and charismatic species into lesser known species. Wildlife Action Plan, 1983-2001. I remember 1983 when it was launched in Mumbai by the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi. It was a very small book, only 5 programs. 2002 to 2016, it increased to slightly bigger. And 2017 to 2031, the third one, which we are now, it's probably a huge booklet. The first action plan was the foundation plan. The second action plan was to reduce the impact of human population growth and wild resource use on wildlife. The third action plan, it focuses on landscape level approach, strengthening of PA network, coastal and marine ecosystem, human and wildlife conflict, wildlife health management, climate change integration, and it recommends 103 conservation actions and 250 projects. But do we have them? From 2017 to 2031, how many conservation actions are implemented and how many projects are launched? It's a very interesting dichotomy. The Wildlife Action Plan recommends, based on multiple consultation processes, this is what needs to be done. It is the National Board for Wildlife which finally says this is what should take place. So is there a synchrony between the Wildlife Action Plan and the National Board for Wildlife? I think this is something which is probably required. And therefore, there is probably a need for a midterm review on the status of the recommended actions and priorities recommended in the Wildlife Action Plan, rather than initiating totally new projects unless such ones are of great significance. Okay. So I think it's important to go into what has already been recommended rather than starting completely new projects. In-situ conservation, landmark 1985 biogeographic zones and province-based protected area planning, which originated from this campus, not necessarily this campus, into the Wildlife Institute of India in FRI. But this is what the biogeographic zone and province-based, representational province-based network planning brought in our protected area network into about almost closer to the 5%. But the wish list was to take into 10%. I don't think at this point of time, and even in the time frame of many of our young people, we can increase our terrestrial protected area into 10% area. New PS categories such as conservation reserve and community reserve included into the in-situ conservation. But we have made some leeway in the conservation reserve, but community reserves are still not in a phase to come into. And the most recent inclusion is the OECM, other effective conservation measures. But all these are happening because we tend to believe by 2030, 30% of India's wilderness would be under some kind of a protected regime. Currently, we claim that 27% of our wilderness area, be it reserve forests, be it wetlands, are already in some kind of a protected regime. But if it is or not, that's something which needs to be reviewed. The marine protected areas, late 1980s, only 6 marine protected areas were established, and to this day, we have not really changed. I was quite amused reading in the newspapers just a few days back into the Ocean Conference which happened in France. Our honorable minister from the earth sciences declared India has 6.6% of marine protected area, total marine area, 6.6%. When I looked into the database, it doesn't exceed even 1%. So I don't know if our honorable minister was taking several million square kilometers in the Antarctic region and Arctic region have been included into that 6.6%, but that is not in our EEZ. I think it probably needs a review. So the need to integrate PA network with Ramsar, Biosphere Reserve, World Heritage Site. But what is interesting, all these kind of protected areas, Anuranjan will probably talk about World Heritage at some point of time, but they are only a different kind of a management approach. They do not, repeat, do not have a legal provision, legal support. So I think, under a different management approach, many of these areas mostly remain in paper. So I think that's something which we need to be looking at. In the Ex-situ conservation, India had more than 200 zoos. Every princely state had kept aside small areas as zoo. In 1976, the Zoo Expert Committee, when they examined 200 zoos in the country, and they recognized 17 different agencies are managing zoos. And then they recommended that zoos can be classified into large, medium, and small zoos, and they recommended professional human resources. 1987 to 89, the Wildlife Institute of India took a zoo consultancy project, and they recommended establishment of the Central Zoo Authority. Central Zoo Authority came into being in 1990 with regulatory guidelines, zoo recognition rules, shift from zoos being entertainment centers to education, awareness, and centers of wildlife. And it is interesting to say, while we say the zoo's role is to shift into conservation mode, the real ex-situ conservation successes has not come from the zoos. The most successful program, the crocodile conservation program, the pygmy hawk program in East, and the vulture program, they are all independent programs not run by zoos. So I think our zoos have a lot of mile to cover if they really want to project them as conservation centers. So more scientific approach, focus on conservation breeding of rare and threatened species, that needs to be the focus. But what is ironical at this point of time, there is currently a visible shift into establishment of generalist and visitor enjoyment-centric mega zoos rather than conservation-focused ex-situ objective-based zoos in India, which requires attention and review. Interestingly, our new Central Zoo Authority gentleman is here. I think, I just thought I will focus this particular slide for your benefit. Okay. Capacity building for wildlife in conservation, institutional, 1982, setting up of this facility, Wildlife Institute of India. It just completed 43 years recently. For both managerial and scientific cadres, the other institutions, SACON, scientific, LACON in Hyderabad, again a professional, KFRI, one of the oldest one in Kerala, Advanced Institute of Wildlife Conservation in Chennai, School of Wildlife Forensic and Health in Jabalpur, largely oriented to wildlife health, and again, a most recently funded and most recently hugely funded center, the National Referral Center for Wildlife at Junagadh, is something which is completely addressing into referral cases, but probably the most funded center at this point of time. But these are institutional. But the need for establishment of regional centers for the Wildlife Institute of India, it has already established the Southern Center in SACON, but India being so huge and so diverse, probably the institute need to set up more regional centers, as well as the need for strengthening state wildlife management institutions for capacity building of frontline staff. The institute is largely focusing into top-level management, but we need to be focusing a lot more into the grassroots level. If 30% of our area is under protected status, we need trained manpower to manage them. Academic institutions for wildlife conservation. The first one is the AVC College in Tamil Nadu. Yesterday, I think someone from the AVC College was sitting with me in a thing. The second one was WII, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh, NCBS Bangalore, BBE, Dr. Bharucha is sitting here, SACON Coimbatore, North Orissa University, CES, Indian Institute of Science Bangalore, BNHS Mumbai, research-based PhDs, ICER, we just had the first presentation in the morning, ICER work, Amity University, Noida, but there are a lot of universities which are actually now giving master's degree with wildlife focus. But one thing which makes me wonder, who is teaching those? Who are teaching them? What kind of a background the teachers come from? So I think it is important not only to create a large number of master's program, but the master's program of university must have the right kind of teaching faculty. Need to integrate managerial inputs into these institutions for a more practical wildlife management outcome. Review the current process of obtaining permit for wildlife research. People sitting here, all of them, many of them will probably have gone through the process of getting a permit for conducting research. I have repeatedly been talking about that. During the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act amendment, I actually wrote this 1972 Wildlife Protection Act must facilitate research permit much more quickly rather than the current state of time it is taking. plan and prevent brain drain. A lot of people, Wildlife Institute is running probably the, I don't know what is the current MSc program, but a lot of students, after all that investment on them, are actually going out and serving in Northern Hemisphere or in Europe. I think, we must stop that brain drain. But if we can stop that brain drain, only by providing those wildlife professionals, creating employment opportunities. I think, this is something which the government of India, states, and even institutions like Institute. Currently, the Wildlife Institute of India, I am told, has more than 600 people research. What is the future for them? Where are they going to be working on a professional level? And there are multiple number of academic institutions which are coming out with products. Where are they going to go? Possibly research is an opportunity. There are also a lot of other employment opportunities which are coming. I just wanted to bring in the eco-development initiatives for PS. Eco-development as a word was coined in 1948 in the United States, but India brought in the eco-development program not on the ecological development, but addressing to the issues of people living in the surrounding landscape of the protected area. That was India's own program of addressing issues beyond the boundary of the protected area, community involvement, regeneration and restoration of wildlife habitat and water resources for both wildlife and community, livestock betterment, alternate livelihood for reduction of dependency of forest resources, and village relocation. I think, many of our wildlife managers have done wonderful work on the eco-development programs. But India Eco-Development Program is no longer in existence, but those who are doing the wildlife management course here, they do write a eco-development sub-plan when they write a management plan. So I think what is required at this point of time is a review of the eco-development program and possibly a more inclusive and multidisciplinary eco-development planning approach, addressing not just beyond the PA, but also the overall adjoining forested landscape. If we have taken the overall forested landscape into 30% of our so-called protected landscape, we must address this issue of beyond the boundary, who are the beneficiaries of the protected area. So I think this eco-development program must address this issue. Most used technology in wildlife conservation, early 1970s, chemical tranquilizers-based restraint. It is something which came into Sundarban Tiger Reserve. John Staden-Sticker, the first person who used the chemical restraint. 1980s, radio telemetry, implantable telemetry, camera traps, GIS technology. 1990s, chips, microchips for marking individuals, cryopreservation, conservation genetics. 2000, the first satellite telemetry done with 2 bar-headed geese in Keolado, Ghana, and other telemetry. And now you have drone, artificial intelligence, eDNA. The technologies, I think, I am older, much older. I don't even know many of the technologies. I think youngsters sitting here will probably come up with a greater list of technology. But what is important here to review, the technology import bottlenecks. We have a huge number of bottlenecks of, if you want to buy a transmitter, satellite transmitter, you have to go through a horrible number of processes and facilitate the process. Also, on genetic research involving tissue exchange, support and facilitate collaborations and international exchange programs for rapid technology transfer. I think this is something which needs to be taken up at the Government of India level. Wildlife NGOs as complementing agencies. I have given the list of BNHS, the oldest one, WWF India, WPSI, WTI, NCF, Aranyak, Corbett Foundation, WCT, and there are many others. At the international level, in India we have the IUCN, we have the WCS, the Nature Conservancy, Wetland International, CI, Panthera, ISLT, and many others. This provides an opportunity for many of our youngsters. The total number of people employed by the government sector or the official sector is probably far less than the number of people which are employed under the NGO sector. So that's an opportunity, but are the NGOs being facilitated? I think it's important to seek constructive criticisms and suggestions from these organizers for a greater complementary environment. We consider NGOs are always being critical. I think criticism is not always negative. Criticism is often constructive, and we need to take their suggestions in a constructive manner. Wildlife conservation legislation, India is probably the only country where we have acts for everything, the largest number of legislation any country ever has. But in the conservation sector, Wildlife Protection Act, the EIA, the CRZ, Forest Regulatory Act, Biodiversity Act, and many others. But they have been amended so many times. But review how these acts and legislations and their amendments are more ecologically favoring while facilitating development aspirations. Much of the changes that is happening, amendments are happening, largely for facilitating developmental aspirations. As professionals, call a spade, even if it is unpleasant. Let science prevail, let conservation prevail. But we must train our youngsters to call a spade a spade. International conventions, again, India is a signatory to almost all conventions. Probably the first one is the International Whaling Commission. But we do not have a mechanism to address the issues what was addressed in a conference of parties. And 3 years later, when we go for a conference of parties, we don't have a mechanism to see what have we done. So I think it's emphasized the need for establishment of an enabling national secretariat of international conventions with professional, scientific, and administrative personnel to address the issues that are to be taken up between conference of parties of all conventions, and that facilitate and help wildlife conservation in a big way. We commit, but we must be complementing with a mechanism that meets the requirements. Shift from exclusive to more inclusive wildlife management approach. Our protected area management is completely exclusive. This is not permitted, that is not permitted, this cannot happen. It's a complete protectionist approach. It is time that we bring in more stakeholders, examine feasibility of beyond the total protectionist approach, recognize community initiative in conservation. Already some initiatives, things are happening. Promote new model of public-private partnership wildlife management through corporate social responsibility support. Examine the feasibility of tribal communities managing landscapes on their traditional systems. The wonderful things that is happening in Australia is the Aborigines maintaining almost 30% of their protected areas. Same thing is happening in Brazil. Same thing is happening of all the places, Canada. But why can't we think of experimenting something like that in northeastern India, where 95% of the forest actually belong to the community? So can we open the door for managing forests by the tribal communities themselves? Enhancing India's role in IUCN, we have an IUCN country office. In the 10,500 specialists in the 6 commissions of the IUCN, India has the largest number of experts. Out of 10,500, almost 2,000, more than 2,000 experts are from India. India has an IUCN office, but we need to increase our professional memberships in the 6 commissions of the IUCN. Attempts to be included in the IUCN's governance structure. In Abu Dhabi, the next IUCN Congress is going to happen, and possibly some of you might be participating in that, but we need to increase our presence in the IUCN governance, strengthen and support the IUCN India for a greater role in the Asia region and international arena. Enhancing the global role of India in wildlife conservation through taking proactive roles in the Central Asian Flyway, the Global Tiger Forum, and the IBCA, which we are going to listen to tomorrow here, through the SARC, through SAVEN, and also through the multilateral agencies initiatives such as World Bank, GEF, UNDP, UNADB, GIZ. All these multilateral agencies are mostly confined doing regional basis or a few work in the India basis, but it's important to realize India's role must be enhanced in a wildlife conservation in a much more global level. What I wanted to say, these 3 presentations is my take home. Wildlife conservation in India has successfully crossed the impact of green revolution, white revolution, open economy, debate over economy and development versus ecology, and now the challenge is from our shift of development agenda to marine environment under the blue economy. We are shifting our economic focus into blue economy. Our EEZ would be probably soon going to see deep sea mining, large-scale major fishing operations, and so on, and as well as our aspiration to be one of the largest economies of the world, and therefore the preparedness for the impact on conservation. Yes, all these agenda are development agenda. But what kind of an impact this is going to have, at least on the 30% which we are claiming. By 2030, we will have this 30% area as our wildlife conservation or nature conservation area. What would be the impact on that? I think, one presentation which talked about the corridors for the elephants, the corridor will probably not be there if the 6-lane highway is going to come. So where do you compromise? I think we need to be looking at the greater, larger picture and say, how can we redefine our development agenda that safeguards our conservation, not just the habitat, but also the species conservation, so on. The next one, forums like this ICON. How many events like this happen in the world, in the country? ICON and the Ecology Conference, the Society for Conservation Biology, YETI, the Indian Science Congress, does not. Repeat, Indian Science Congress hardly has any focus on conservation-related issue. I think, we need to be increasing such forums. I think, on 28, the CES is having one in Bangalore. So I think, we need to be. I think, Amity University is a master's program. Will they be doing something like that? I think, more such icons, more such wildlife ecology conferences, wildlife conservation conferences, and they will be the ones who will provide the new path for conservation. Outcomes from such forum should not end just meeting here and going away. Outcomes from this forum must reach the government through multiple media, through academic outputs, and through suggestions originating collectively. Older generation, medium generation, younger generation are appealing to the government. This is what the new path should be. How much of it is going to be heard? That's a different question. But we must, from forums like this, must reach out to the government. And finally, can India be in the pole position? Can India be in the pole position, if not globally, in the southern hemisphere to begin with, through its traditional and cultural wisdom, as well as the innovations of its new generation? We are old. It's time for us to hang our boots. But it is time for you youngsters, with your innovations, with your outreach, and with your brand new ideas, to integrate conservation and development as the new path in safeguarding wildlife and nature. That's my question. I'm not appealing that this must happen, but my question is, can the younger generation ready to take over? Thank you very much. If there is any question I can take. Did I take a longer time? Just in time. Yeah. No more questions. Okay.
Okay, I'll just thank you, and then you can take questions if there are. Yeah. Thank you, Professor B.C. Chowdhury, for your extremely insightful talk and for taking us through the history of conservation efforts in India. And your experience really shines through in the way that you painted such an informative picture of wildlife conservation and what is required in the future by the upcoming future conservationists, which I think is very important in today's day and age. So thank you again. We don't have much time, but if there are any questions, feel free to ask. But soon after, we'll have to break for lunch, and please be back by 2 for the oral presentations that will commence in 4 parallel sessions.
Anyway, I'm around, so people can always ask questions. Absolutely no problem.
There is a question.
Oh, some question. Okay. Someone is asking.
BC, that was brilliant. Have we done enough for Aichi Target 1 in all our efforts that we've made? Like, have we really been able to do communication, education, public awareness at the level that we need today? That's just one thing. But
Before you go to the next one, let me answer that. I am only asking you, have you handed over the baton to the next generation? Because you were the one who started it all, taking the education sector into the universities and so on. My question is, have you shifted that baton to the next generation?
I think I have.
Okay, good.
But, and some of them are doing much better work than I have ever done, so that's something I'm very proud of. But I also want to remind this particular audience today that this organization has had, this institute has had brilliant innovators. They've had brilliant scientists. They have brilliant administrators and foresters who came out of this organization and went out and did wonderful wildlife conservation. And I think that is what you have to take, that heritage has come from this institute. And you can never forget that. As alumni of this place, you therefore have a responsibility. We had a responsibility. I don't think we did good enough, right?
Yeah, I agree that. I fully agree with you.
But I think these guys, and the other thing is they've got numbers, right? We had handfuls. And if you can get together and do things, I think you'll be so much more effective than these champions like BC and Qureshi, the people who have taught you here. They were brilliant. And then you go a little further back and you have Pawar Saab and you have Savarkar and you have Alan Rogers. They've been brilliant teachers of wildlife conservation that went out from this tremendous institution. It's got a terrific heritage. Thank you, BC. That was just super.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Coming from you, it really is a compliment. Thank you.
We will now break for lunch till 2 p.m., after which the oral presentations will commence. Thank you.